Okay, good evening and welcome to the National Humanities Center. I'm Jeffrey Harpham, director of the center. Before I say anything else, I'd just like to say that we know that the upper part of the parking lot can be a little slick, and if anybody would like to have a staff member go get their car for them or help them out to their car, we'd be happy to assist in any way possible. This is the first public lecture of the new year, but so many extraordinary events have crowded into the time since we last met in December to hear Maria Georgopoulos speak that it truly does seem like a brand new year. That year began tragically in Arizona, but I think we all share the hope that the tone and import of the President's words last night prevail as we go forward. The President spoke last night about the need to expand our moral imaginations, to resist the temptation of easy explanations, and to find a way to a more civil discourse. And in our own way, we at the Center are committed to these goals. And these public lectures, in which scholars share the fruits of their labors with their colleagues and with the public, in an open environment where they can be questioned and even challenged, are an important part of that commitment. This afternoon, we're gathered to hear Professor James Engell, the Gurney Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University, where he has taught for over 30 years, where he received his PhD, where he did his undergraduate work. He may in fact have been born at Harvard, but his CV only begins with his undergraduate years. So, Jim Engell is for me, I hope he doesn't mind my saying this, he is for me a shining example of the value of tenure. He began his career rapidly with a book called The Creative Imagination, Enlightenment to Romanticism, published when he was barely 30 years old. An edition of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Biographia Literaria just 2 years later, and a major edited collection on Johnson and his age, all accomplished by the age of 33, by which time he had tenure in the Harvard department that had hired him after granting him both his degrees. This is remarkable in any context, but astonishing if you know how Harvard usually works. And then while continuing to produce scholarly work, he began to think, having achieved tenure, began to think seriously about the larger issues that affect higher education. He co-edited a volume called Teaching Literature, What is Needed Now. He wrote a book called The Committed Word, Literature and Public Values. He co-authored a book called Saving Higher Education in the Age of Money. I remember acquiring this book 5 years ago when it was published, and I misread the title as Saving Money for the Age of Higher Education. I had a child in school and another one about to go, but it's actually called Saving Higher Education in the Age of Money. And then most recently, he co-edited a deeply impressive volume called Environment, an Interdisciplinary Anthology. For all its achievement, this is a career that is strongly marked by modesty, and that he's chosen to work on a wide range of fields, including some altogether outside his professional field, so that there's no question of professional advancement. And I also note the unusually large number of co-authored and co-edited volumes which speak not only to modesty, but to collegiality. He has, in short, become one of those admirable and rare people that the tenure system aspires to create. In its ideal essence, tenure extends trust to people so that they can do whatever seems to them most worth doing without regard to immediate self-ends or professional advancement. The center itself is dedicated to this ideal, and so it's entirely fitting that Jim Engell is spending this year here as the GlaxoSmithKline Fellow, where he's working on an intellectual and critical biography of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So now you know what tenure is for, but what we've gathered here to learn this afternoon is the answer to the question, which is also Jim Engell's title, what is college for?
Thank you very much, Jeff. That's extraordinarily kind, and I hope that I can live up to it. I'd like to thank the center and its staff for helping prepare this lecture today, but also just for being here this year and other years. I'd like to thank GlaxoSmithKline as well, our neighbors who seem to be completely around us on both sides, for providing the endowment for the fellowship that I hold. My friend Andy Del Banco said something along these lines. He said when he came to the National Humanities Center, he thought he'd died and gone to heaven. But I actually think that Andy undersold the place, because I don't think there's homemade soup in heaven on Fridays. And however angelic the staff is in heaven, and I'm sure they are, I actually don't think they're as efficient, and I certainly don't think they have as good a sense of humor as the staff here does. And finally, I think there's something else. There's a reception afterwards here, and it would probably be a matter of considerable debate amongst groups of believers whether wine for convivial consumption actually exists in heaven. But it does here, and so I hope you'll join us in the reception afterwards. Jeff, you would think from how well he gives these introductions, has nothing else to do with his time, but I wanted you to pull out your calendars, if you have them, or make a mental note that exactly 1 week from now, almost to the minute, Jeff is going to be giving a talk himself at Duke on the humanities and the dream of America. He's giving it in what's called a garage. I'm not sure. I assume it's a big garage, And it's sponsored by the Franklin Humanities Institute, the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute. But that's just one of so many things that Jeff has done. So I'm extraordinarily thankful to him and to the center and to GlaxoSmithKline for this opportunity to be here. Well, what is college for? That's one of the three things that I'd like to talk about this evening. I'd like to try to give an answer to that question, a serious answer. But another thing that I'd like to talk about is the one thing college is for, in fact, is increasingly dividing the United States into two separate nations or classes. A class which has gone to college and a class which has not. And that this division is increasingly serious and should cause us all consternation and even alarm. College is a good thing, and I would never want to be quoted as saying that it isn't anything but a good thing. But good things often have unintended consequences. And one of the unintended consequences of our desire and our veneration of college education is that we are creating a two-class system in the United States of those who have attended, and especially those who have graduated from college, and those who, for whatever reason, have not. So finally, I'd like to try to suggest ways in which we can combat this alarming unintended consequence of college. 53 years ago, Nathan Pusey, who was then president of Harvard, said, "I was disturbed to read a report of a student's speech which maintained that today's college senior views his education simply as a means toward a better paying job, more security, and social positions. If there are students who seriously believe this, then it seems to me they've missed the point of college, or indeed of being alive, and that we're in for trouble. America has no need of a race of young people fitted to the same pattern, contented to sit back and enjoy what's been called a prosperous conformity. Our country will always have room for imaginative, reasonable, and responsible men and women, and it desperately needs the informed and truly creative among young people." That was 1957 in a piece that Pusey called, "What is College For?" But let's turn the clock back a little more, because this has been a long-standing question. Here is Woodrow Wilson in 1909, 102 years ago. He says, whoever understands just one single process and some single piece of work which he has been set out to do will never do anything else, and is apt to be deprived at almost any moment of the opportunity to do even that, because processes change, and industries undergo instant revolutions. New inventions, fresh discoveries, and alterations in the market throw accustomed methods and the men who are accustomed to them out of date and use without pause or pity. Moreover, it's a day in which no enterprise stands alone or independent, but is related to every other and feels changes in all parts of the globe. I think those very same words could be applied exactly today. That's Woodrow Wilson writing in Scribner's Monthly in 1909 in an article he entitled, "What is a College For?" So the subject tonight is by no means original. It's one that has persisted for well more than a century, and I suspect it's going to persist for a lot longer. But I think it now has a remarkable new urgency. And I'd first like to set out why that's the case. I'd like to do that with just a few statistics and graphs. So, how many people are actually going to college? Well, in the 20th century alone, you can see the trend. It's probably one familiar to you, from a low percentage in the 1930s, and if you go back earlier, it's even much lower. At the end of the 19th century, it would barely make it onto this chart. 1990, 1998, where now of college age eligible individuals, you have well more than 60% or so actually enrolled in college. That doesn't mean that they graduate. It doesn't mean that they're all in a four-year institution, but it means they're going on to some form of college. And concomitantly with this trend, how much does college cost? You probably all know the answer to that, especially if you have a child who's thinking about going to college or who have gone to college. But let's keep in mind that 80% of all students who attend college in the United States go to a public institution. 80%. Now, what has happened to the cost of public higher education? It really has gone up extraordinarily quickly. So this is just one little slice from several years ago. In that 1 year, my home state of Massachusetts increased tuition and fees 28%, while it lowered available scholarship by 28%. Not a very good situation. University of Virginia added 20%, California 27%, Arizona State University 40%. These are just some selections from the increased costs, and you all know from having read news reports recently that public education has increased its costs at a rate much faster than the rate of inflation, much faster. And this presents a terrible problem for people who rely on it as an affordable means of higher education, which again is 80% of those who attend college in the United States. Well, what's the outlook for the next few years? I think it's worse. Costs are going to continue to go up. It was just reported yesterday, I heard it via Robert Reich, that this coming year, out of 50 states, 43 will reduce their budgets for higher education. Reduce their budgets for higher education. That can't possibly mean that it's going to get cheaper to go to a public institution. They won't be increasing their financial aid budgets either. And what Robert Reich also said was that Pell Grants are going to be squeezed. Now, squeezed is not an empirically precise term, so I don't know exactly what that means, but I do know it's the opposite of expanded. So Pell Grants squeezed, costs up. The situation for public education in many, if not almost all states, looks increasingly difficult for people of modest means to send their children there without them or their children incurring significant debt. Who's hit hardest? So here's some figures going down to 2006 from the Center for Higher Education in San Jose. In 1980, if you took mean family income, and you reckon what percent of it was necessary to spend on public college tuition of people in the lowest economic quartile, that is, people in the bottom 25%. In 1980, they had to spend 13% of their income on average to send a child to higher education. By 2000, it was 25%. By 2006, it was 45%. That's for the bottom economic quartile. Now you can say, well, there are scholarships available. Indeed there are. But not all those students are going to be top performers. A lot of them will be just average performers. Scholarships don't make up for it. 60%, the majority, of public scholarship money goes to students to lure them because of their performance and is not based on need. How many colleges in the United States, public and private, actually have need-blind admission, and then if they admit you, also give you as much aid as you need to attend? As I say, there are two components here. First, you have to be admitted without reference to your need. And then once you're admitted, they actually have to give you the aid that they think that you need in order to attend. How many colleges in the United States actually do this? Only about 30. And many of them are smaller, well-endowed, liberal arts and sciences colleges that are highly selective. In other words, they will take only the very best students, as much as they try for socioeconomic diversity. So this is a difficult situation. It's really, I think, really a problematic situation in many respects. We're creating, in some ways, an unimaginative credentializing situation where there are increasing income differentials. And if you take a look at your handout on page 3, I know you've probably already scoured this handout because it was out there for you, but take a look at your handout on page 3, and you'll see on the right-hand column, higher education equals higher pay. You'll see high school graduate at $33,800, median full-time year-round worker, 25 or older. Bachelor's degree, $55,700. Now, in 2001, the New York Times reported that from the 1970s to 2000, the earning advantage for those who attended college doubled from 30% to 60%. So in other words, the stakes go up. If you go to college, on average, your earning ability was only 30% greater in 1970. In 2000, it was 60% greater. Now, you do the math on this most recent figure from the New York Times, which I got just from September 2010. Do the figure with 33.8 and 55.7, and it's more than 60%. It's about 65%. So the notion that somehow or other all of this evens out over time is just erroneous. It doesn't even out, it diverges. It gets worse and worse. That is to say, if you don't go to college now, your earnings ability will be markedly lower than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And there seems no end to the trend. It might end, but there's no indication that it will. So I think we should assume prudentially that it will continue. This is something, again, that's particularly alarming for people who are not earning a great deal of money. Voltaire once defined government as that organization which takes money away from some people and gives it to others. It's a pretty clever one-line definition of government, not complete, but maybe necessary to remember. You'd say, well, maybe all of these differences are somehow closed by our tax system. Maybe there's a way in which people who aren't so well off, not being taxed as much, somehow reap the advantages of benefits provided by taxation to which people who earn more pay more taxes. Well, the Wall Street Journal, Al Hunt of the Wall Street Journal, commented not too long ago that at least in the late 90s, and I honestly think the situation is not much different, if indeed any better than it was then, is that citizens earning in excess of $100,000 then paid 65% of taxes, but that they actually reaped 71% of the benefits. The broad middle class paid 35% of taxes, and the broad middle class got 29% of benefits. And Al Hunt's comment about this was, now there's income redistribution. Now, that's just one statistic, and there are other ways to look at it, but I think the point is that our tax system and the tuition charged at public institutions is making higher education less affordable for the middle class. It's making it considerably less affordable for the middle class. Moreover, the share of total wealth, I'm not talking about income now, but the share of total wealth is tilting more to the well-to-do, and not only away from poorer families, but away even from the middle class. So here's share of income by income group, 1980 to 2004. The top 5% share of income went up quite markedly. The middle 20% saw a slight decrease in their share of national income. And the bottom 20% saw a rather significant decrease. Doesn't look like much, but when you go from 4.2% to 3.4%, that's quite a big percentage change. Now take a look at your handout, and take a look at page 1. This is the actual United States wealth distribution. Let me remind you again, this is not income distribution. This is wealth. This is net worth. Plotted against the estimated and the ideal distributions across all respondents. Where did I get this from? It's from the note near the bottom of that page. It's Michael Norton and Dan Ariely, who is at Duke here, Building a Better America, One Wealth Quintile at a Time. So you look at this graph and you see the actual wealth distribution at the top. And you see that the top 20% go all the way up to 80-some% of the wealth. And then the second 20% in the United States go up to the high 90s. And the middle 20% go all the way almost to the end. And you say, okay, well, what about the fourth quintile? Well, you can't see it because it isn't even 1 pixel wide. As they note, because of their small percentage share of total wealth, both of the fourth quintile at 0.2%, that's 0.2%, and the bottom 20% at 0.1%, are not visible in this chart. They have vanished. They've disappeared. You can't really put them on a graph like this. There's no way you can. Now, what do people in this country actually estimate that the wealth distribution is? That's the middle bar. The estimate is that the top 20% have almost 60%. And then it goes on. You can see the red, the green, the purple, and the lighter blue. So that's what people think it actually is, but it's very far from that. And then the bottom one is what people think the ideal would be. It's a broad survey of a number of people in the country. And people think the ideal would be, that the top 20% should have maybe a third, and so forth. It's an interesting paper because it shows that the ideal is very far from the actual, but the estimated is actually very far from the actual as well. Now, on the other side of that the page labeled 2, I will leave for you to study. I'm not quite sure how revelatory it is. The breakdown in wealth distribution plotted against the estimated and ideal distributions of respondents of different income levels themselves and different political affiliations and genders. Now, my immediate reaction to this chart when I first looked at it, and it's still in large measure my reaction, is that they're all pretty close. There aren't any huge lopsided differences here. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or voted for Bush or Kerry, or you're a man or a woman, or you earn a lot or you earn a little, your approximation of what the wealth distribution is fairly close to one another. So in other words, it's not skewed a great deal. Okay, our economy grows. At least we hope it does. So shouldn't the middle class and the bottom quintile and the quintile above that be earning more money? Shouldn't their actual income be going up? But the rather frightening news is that the decade that we're just concluding is the first in which Americans on average have seen their incomes decline. So you can say, well, we've had a recession the last 2 years. Well, let's turn it back to 2007 then. Let's just compare 2000 to 2007, just those 7 years. Yes, there were years of 9/11 and turbulence, but you know, at a certain point, you're going to have to say, are we earning more money or not? And the answer is that the middle class is not. In 2000, in $2007, all this is given in $2007. In 2000, the middle class averaged in at $50,557. But by 2007, it had declined to $50,233. In other words, stalled out. Maybe it isn't statistically significant that it actually went down $300, but it didn't go up. So the middle class is not earning any more than it did a decade ago. So the idea that somehow economic growth will pull us out of this and that the middle class will be one of those boats on a rising tide that lift all boats, at least is not true in the last 10 years. Certainly not true from 2000 to 2007. So let's take a look at this quickly from another perspective by income group. And we're going to compare the highest income quartile with the lowest income quartile. So, you have on the left those attending college, and you're saying in the highest income quartile, you have 64% of those individuals who are actually attending college. But in the lowest income quartile, only 14% are attending college. This data is from 2006, by the way. It's not that old. Actually earning a bachelor's degree, in other words, graduating, because we all know graduation rates vary and not everyone who goes to college graduates. But in the highest income quartile, you've got 46% versus 8%. And then on the right, you have the percentage of family income needed to pay for college. It's 11% for those in the highest quintile, and it's 45% for those in the lowest quintile. These are pretty sobering figures, and the problem with a lot of them is that the trends that are there that have created these divergencies are increasing. It's even worse in a way when you realize how much students are borrowing now to pay for their education and how much debt they have when they get out of college. The single most accurate predictor of any student's SAT score is their zip code. And it's their zip code because that is the best amalgamation of income level, school district, and peers that you go to school with. So you can chart SAT scores all across the country, and you're going to find out that their strongest correlation is with zip code. Now, I could give another talk on what this means about local control of schools and local funding of schools, but you can give that talk to yourself. There's serious problems in our country with making a completely graven image of local control of public schools and property tax local funding of public schools. It does not create equality of opportunity. It does not. So if you believe in equality of opportunity, I think you would have to reject the idea that the way that we run our public schools in many places in the country is at all acceptable, let alone ideal. It was actually easier in 1970, as research by Tom Kane and others have shown, it was easier in 1970 for a good student from the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder to attend a selective college than it is today. And certainly far more affordable for them to attend a public institution. So we're creating a reciprocally reinforcing engine of wealth and higher education, where families that are well-to-do have all of the advantages of sending their students to college, who then will go on to make more income to pass on to their family and their children. And over generation, from generation to generation, this does not have the effect of evening out. Norton and Ariely also were interviewed about Americans' perception of how much wealth actually churns in the United States. And it turns out that most Americans believe that the top rail goes down to the bottom and the bottom rail goes on to the top a lot more frequently than it actually happens. Wealth in this country tends to exist in families over generations, rather than suddenly and quickly to change. Of course, there are marvelous stories about people going from rags to riches, and there always will be. But we hear about them because they are the very considerable exceptions to the very strong rule, which is that it doesn't happen as often as Americans in general think that it does. So to put the case perhaps strongly, this is a pretty good scheme to turn a democracy into a plutocracy. A rather broad-based plutocracy, admittedly, maybe not an oligarchy, but a plutocracy, nevertheless. A government by the wealthy. So we have the frightening fact that one of the things college is for now, though unintentionally so, is widening the gap in income distribution in this country and widening the gap in wealth distribution. There are also very significant other benefits that college provides that are not economic that we need to think about. So turn back to number 3 on your handout, because here's the added whammy. It isn't just money. There are social benefits, as mentioned in that right-hand column. Those with a bachelor's degree are more likely to volunteer, they're more likely to vote, they're more likely to exercise and have health insurance, they're more likely to have pensions, they're less likely to smoke, they're less likely to be obese, and they are less likely to have low birth weight babies. All those things are pretty important. And people who get through college are all statistically, and there are others too, the article doesn't mention all of them, they're less likely to be victims of crime, for example. Well, correlation is not the same as causation, it isn't, but when you add up all of these things, which side would you rather be on? And I think the answer is pretty clear. You'd rather be on the side of, in a population that is far less likely to have obesity, far more likely to have health insurance, and so on. It all correlates with college education in quite a strong way. Now flip over to number 4 on your handout. Here's an interesting issue. It comes from Bradford Wilcox, The Evolution of Divorce, published fall of 2009. And it's the graph that I'd like to call your attention to. On the left, you have, it's written vertically, but it's the percent divorced within 10 years. And then you have that plotted against time from 1970 through the mid-90s. The line that has the box associated with it is non-college educated couples, and their divorce rate within 10 years goes from about a third to more than a third. The divorce rate of those couples who are college educated goes from about a quarter down to not much more than 15%. Now, if you've got a pen or a pencil, I'd like you to make an addition to this graph. If you're going to keep it, I think it's worthwhile. Make a box somewhere up around 50. That's off the scale. But go ahead and make a box somewhere up around 50. And then make a diamond down around 6. So the box is non-college educated couples. And that box you just made up around 50 is the percentage of births of those couples out of wedlock. And the diamond down around 6 is the percentage of those couples with out of wedlock births who are college educated. Now, if any of our experience sociologically of the last 50 years has taught us anything about out of wedlock births, it's taught us that it is a drag on populations who have very high percentage of out of wedlock births. It creates all kinds of issues. And what we are seeing not only is a divorce divide, but an out of wedlock birth divide in our population, perhaps not based, but reflected by the fact that they have attended college and gone through college or not. There's an irony in all of this, because the U.S. Department of Labor estimates that in the foreseeable future, only about 30% of all American jobs require more than a high school education. Yet we've got about 60% of students attempting college courses. Now, do I think all these students should be going to college? Of course I do. That's wonderful that they're trying to do that. But the fact is that we don't have that number of jobs that actually require a college education. So of course a lot of college graduates are now finding that they are without jobs when they get out. In part because although the skills once they get a job are in demand and they're paid more, that there are lots of jobs that can be filled by someone else. Let me give you just one example. Recently, 2 major banks in the United States hired more people to process mortgages. You know that this has been a hot item in the news, and you know, some people tended to do robo-signing and other people did it carefully and the like. Well, one of these major banks decided that for mortgage processing individuals, they should have a college degree. They didn't say why, they didn't justify it, they just said, gotta have a college degree. Another major US bank said, gotta have a high school degree, that's all. Many times, institutions, businesses simply set a bar in order to keep a huge number of applications out. We all know this. You say, must have college degree, must have X years of experience. I worry that this kind of pure credentializing, which I think has become increasingly mindless, is driving the very problem that we've just seen in the last quarter hour. In other words, as soon as you say that certain jobs absolutely have to have a college education, when in fact they really don't, if the person is well prepared, has a good high school education, has good skills, they perfectly easily could do that job. But many of those jobs are now open only to college graduates simply because Someone has decided in human resources that that's the bar that needs to be passed. And I think in many cases, it's not necessary. Now, certainly in some cases it is, and certainly very specific training is necessary for a lot of jobs. But I think that it is creating an added effect which doesn't help the situation at all. In all of this, of course, what happens is students see high school as a mere stepping stone to get into college, and if they're not going to college, high school is a kind of dead end. High school has become very problematic for this reason in the United States, and I think a lot of educational professionals see a lot of problems falling in on high schools, on secondary schools. But it's also true that many students see college just as a stepping stone to professional degrees. So college becomes purely an instrument and not an end in itself. So to get back to the question we started with, what is college for? Let's ask some of the students themselves. In the 1960s, in a survey that's been done every year by UCLA, in the 1960s, of all freshmen entering college, 20% said they were going to college for high-wage employment. The other 80% said they were going to college to form a social vision, experiment with knowledge, have a philosophy of life, all of those hazy things. 1960s. Maybe you can write it down to the 60s, I don't know. But that's what students said then. That's what they actually said. These are very consistent surveys taken over long periods of time. In the 1990s, there's a complete flip-flop. Now in the 1990s, only 20% of the students said they were going to college to develop a philosophy of life, and 80% of them said they were going to college to get high-wage employment. So there's this sea change in student attitudes, very significant sea change in student attitudes. In 1998, 3/4 of all freshmen said they're going to make more money, 75% said that, they're going to get a better job. In 2002, one objective considered essential was not just being well off financially, but being very well off financially. There were different choices students could make, and the one they chose was being very well off financially. Identified by male freshmen more than any other as a reason for going to college. The women weren't far behind, just a few percentage points. The 6 lowest objectives in 2002 were influencing the political structure. That was low. Helping clean up the environment. Making a theoretical contribution to science. Becoming accomplished in one of the performing arts. Creating artistic work and writing original works. These were the lowest. That is to say, these received the least attention from students for why they were going to college. In 1968, Louis Kampf, who was then a professor at MIT, said that students were becoming aware that their studies and their degree made them a more valuable piece of property, that is, a commodity. And the college was transforming each student into an object, a thing, not a person, a saleable certificate. Meanwhile, certain things were happening within higher education. And now I'd like to talk about the 3 criteria. Higher education itself was undergoing changes. Fields were growing while other fields were relatively shrinking. So for example, if you look back in the 1950s and 60s and you look at the number of majors or the number of faculty or faculty salaries, you'll see that the humanities, for example, were doing fairly well. You look at the situation just a few years ago and you'll see that the number of degrees given, the salaries, the new building space, the alumni giving, take any measure you wish. And you'll see that certain fields have fallen below the mean of growth, and other fields are above the mean of growth. You can identify exactly what these fields are through 3 simple criteria. And if a field meets any one of these criteria, it will have, relative to all other fields, grown. If it doesn't meet any of these three criteria, it will, relative to all other fields, have shrunk in higher education. I have asked many deans and many educational professionals about this, and I think it's a pretty closed case. So here are the criteria. The field promises more money in lifetime earnings to its graduates, even though that promise may be illusory. In other words, a student thinks, well, if I study this, I'm going to earn more money. Or they're told, look, if you study applied biology, you'll earn more money than if you study biology. Natural history doesn't do very well, as you might imagine, in this. Theoretical physics doesn't do very well, as you might imagine. So it isn't just sciences versus non-sciences. Second criteria, the field studies money. Study money, right? You study finance or business or money or economics, of course. And there are many different fields you could put in there. It isn't just economics or business administration, there are quite a few others. It receives significant money from federal grants or private funding. So, if a field satisfies even one of these, it has, relative to all other fields at their mean, grown. If it doesn't, it has, relative to all other fields at their mean, not grown, but shrunk. I hate to say it, but the humanities are all below the median line. That's where they are. They're below. History is actually doing fairly well. The foreign languages aren't doing well. Theology is not doing very well, or religious study. English literature, sort of in the middle of the lower group. Art history doesn't do terribly well, and so on. I just point this out as a mere fact of the growth of American higher education in the last 40 years. You can say, well, it wasn't a conscious decision that this is what drives growth. Maybe not. But these are the criteria that have determined growth in American higher education since about 1970, particularly since the very significant infusion of federal funds. Now, at this point you may say, oh, Professor Engell, you're against money. Nope, I'm not against money at all. I wish people had more of it, and I wish institutions of higher education had more of it, and I don't begrudge anyone who has it what they have. That's not the point. The point is how our system distributes it and whether it views it as a means or as an end. Because if it is viewed increasingly only as an end, then higher education, which is a fairly unregulated market, after all, will continue to grow in this kind of way. So this has caused one of my colleagues at the Harvard Law School to say this: money has become the exclusive denominator. It defines everything: prestige, excellence, competence, commitment to the public good. Now that may be a little over the top. She may have been frustrated when she said that. But I think there's quite a bit of truth to it. I think there is. Though again, as I say, I'm with Mark Twain on the money issue as money. He said, all money's tainted. Trouble is, taint enough. So, here's my answer to what is college for. I think college is for 5 things. Now you can draw up your own list. But it's for 3 instrumental goods. Is it for economic good? You bet it is. It always has been in the United States, it always will be, and it always should be. So, I hope no one leaves and says, Professor Engell thinks it's not good for college to provide people with something that will help them economically. It should provide them with something that helps them economically, and it should provide the country with economic assistance. Absolutely. That's an instrumental good. Now, it should also be for social integration and justice. We don't have national service. We don't tell people, you've got to go into the Peace Corps. We don't tell people, you've got to go build bridges. We don't tell them, you have to go into the military. So we don't have any mechanism in our country to mix people from different backgrounds, to mix people from different areas, to mix people from different income groups. We really don't. You get in an accident on the highway and you might be meeting someone who's a lot different from you. That's one thing. But in general, we don't have a national system of putting our citizens together. The closest thing we have is college. Now, sometimes this is denigrated as the summer camp aspect of college. And I think that kind of cheapens it. College can provide real contact with individuals who are markedly different from us in their background, their assumptions, their income, their beliefs, and where they come from. It's very important. And students who go to college often say they learn as much from their fellow students as they do from their teachers, and I believe that. And a lot of what they learn is because their fellow students are different, and they get different perspectives. It's also for civic and democratic engagement. They're going to have to govern themselves in some way at college, and I hope in some respect they learn what it means to be part of a community and to govern that community. You saw last night the examples of those young people who were part of the University of Arizona's student body and how they were governing themselves, how that young girl who was killed had already joined and was elected to her student council. That's a civic and democratic engagement, and that's an instrumental good which is terribly important, and our education for citizenship is. Then there are two other goods which I think are not instrumental, but knowledge pursued wherever it leads, just human curiosity. We want to know more than we know. I want to know how this works. I want to take it apart. I want to know how creatures evolve in the natural world. I want to understand why this bridge fell apart under stress. I want to understand why this language is related to that language. Whatever. Just innate human curiosity. And then the ethical application of what it is we know. So, a philosophical word for all of these five things would be an entelechy. That's a word that Aristotle uses, and it basically means a set of goals, telos, all focused into one end or institution. But one way I think you can look at it is it's like fingers on a hand. What is college for? Well, it's got some instrumental uses, and then it has some bedrock causes too. Knowledge and the ethical application of it, it becomes like fingers in a hand. My sense is that if you take any one of these and blow it out of proportion and say it's the reason for college, then pretty soon the whole thing becomes unbalanced. And that's true of D just as much as it is of A. That is to say, if you set up an institution in which all you're interested in is knowledge, pure research, that's really not what college is generally in this country, nor do I think it should be. Maybe that's for a certain kind of research institute, fine. But I don't think it's what college is for. Now, sometimes John Henry Cardinal Newman is used as an example, a kind of whipping boy for saying, well, it's all about knowledge no matter what. That it's knowledge for its own sake, period. And that idea has come in for quite a bit of criticism from time to time. But why do I put this long quotation up here? It's not so I read it aloud while you read it silently. We all know that's the worst of PowerPoint. It's for 2 words. As yet. As yet. Even John Henry Cardinal Newman says that these things which we study that don't seem to have any use are regarded as admirable, though they have not as yet proved themselves to be useful. Meaning he is leaving open the door, wide open, for the fact that what it is that we study that doesn't seem to be useful might someday have real use. So one of my favorite examples is there was an area in mathematics called knot theory, K-N-O-T. Knot theory is something I don't really understand, but I suppose it could describe in all kinds of functions the way my tie is tied or something like that. Anyway, it was considered a backwater in mathematical study for quite a while. And then all of a sudden somebody said, hey, wait a minute, a DNA molecule looks like a knot. It's sort of twisted and tied, and all of a sudden knot theory got applied to molecules, biological molecules, and it took off. You know, when the electron was discovered, people didn't have HDTV in mind. They didn't even have the transistor in mind. But none of that would have been possible without that kind of discovery. Now here's a sharper critique by John Kenneth Galbraith, The New Industrial State. And I think one way to read this today would be to substitute the word technological for industrial, because this is an older text. But he says, how readily we assume that education and research must be subordinate to the needs of the industrial system. However, education and research need not be subordinate if it is realized that the educator is the source of the factor of production on which industrial success depends. He must realize this and exert his power not on behalf of the industrial system, meaning not simply to train people for a very specific kind of job, but on behalf of the entire human personality. It's a marvelous statement from, you know, you may not agree with Galbraith's economics, but in other words, that at least for educators, the idea at a certain point is to educate the whole individual, the whole person. There are so many things in our society which cannot be answered by technical means alone. Race relations, environmental problems, the very wealth distribution inequities, if you regard them as inequities, that we have talked about. What does it take? It usually takes a group of people who have enough knowledge of what they all are doing to be able to talk to each other, to come up with the kinds of solutions and imaginative programs that can address these intractable problems. If it were simply for an expert, we'd call in an expert and the problem would be solved. But the most difficult problems that we always face are the ones that mere training can never solve, or it already would have done so. Now you can say, well, what about for students who want to go to law school? Shouldn't they be, you know, really focusing on law? No. Really good law schools, top law schools, say their best performers come from mathematics, music, and languages, particularly, as it turns out, the classics. I don't know why exactly, but that's what they say. And time after time, gauged by grades and law review presence, it's those students who seem to do better than the students who take pre-law or even political science. What do medical school want? Do medical schools want, you know, 10, 15 courses of medicine and biology? No, they don't. Increasingly, over the last 2 decades, medical schools have said, we want college students to take these 5 basic courses: chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, math, biology, but above all, we want entire human beings who are ready to treat other human beings as patients. And that's been an increasing drive of much medical admissions for the last 2 decades. There are even some medical schools now that even wonder whether they should require those 5 major basic courses. I don't think they've yet changed that, but there's debate about it. So what am I doing here? I guess it's true, I admit it, I'm making a plea for liberal education in the arts and sciences as being vitally important, because it also is endangered, and what I have listed as what is a college for might very well be applied to a liberal education, but can be applied to any kind of college education. I'd like to give the last word here to a physicist, actually, Steve Weinberg, who's at the University of Texas. He's a very good theoretical physicist. He wrote a marvelous book some years ago called The First 3 Seconds of the Universe, which was a layman's explanation of the beginning of the Big Bang. But he says, you know, free markets alone don't maximize civilization. If you mean the whole range of public and private goods, the aspect of civilization that concerns him professionally is basic scientific research. Research that cannot be justified by foreseeable economic benefits. And I think the key word there is foreseeable, because so many of the economic benefits that come from this research do come, but they come in unforeseen kinds of ways. They may come a decade later, they may come 2 decades later, 5 years later. They're spin-offs and nobody can predict them. Well, let me go back to the problem that I tried to outline at the beginning of this talk about the increasing division of this country into 2 classes based on college education. What can we do? So I'd like to try to suggest some things that we can actually do. I think as parents we can talk with children about the purposes of education. That's a hard conversation to have, but I think it's a very important one, because increasingly it seems a lot of parents in the United States are telling their children, you've got to get an education to get a good job. And I think that's not a bad way to begin that conversation. I think it's a horrible way to begin it and end it. It just is insufficient. I think we as teachers need to talk with our students about the entire purposes of their education in advising them. I don't think it's enough to say, well, I will teach them French history, or I will teach them differential equations, or I will teach them economics. I think that every teacher in college at some point has the opportunity and the obligation to say to students, well, let's talk about why you're doing what you're doing, or why are you here? And those conversations are hard to have. But if students crave anything in advising, I think it's often those very kinds of conversations. They need them. Promote need-blind admission and full need aid. That's really hard because it costs a lot of money for an institution to do that. So, if you give money to an institution, maybe consider ticking that box for student scholarships and saying it's for need-based scholarships. I don't know, it's a thought. There are several things that are always under-endowed in universities. One is faculty salaries, another is student scholarships, and a third are libraries and laboratories. They never have enough money. And you can say, well, if I give them money for scholarships, they'll take it, but they'll just move other money somewhere else. True, but you will have made a small statement, and if enough people make that kind of statement, it makes a difference. Promote admissions policies based less on standardized test scores and more on rank in high schools. Some colleges have experimented with this, and it seems to work to a significant degree. I think it was Williams that did this. I think the University of Texas system has tried this. In other words, don't so much rely on those ACT and SAT scores, but look at rank in high school. And if the high school isn't so great, okay, it isn't so great, but here's a student who was the best or one of the best students in that high school. Admit that student, see what happens. Those colleges have actually discovered those students do pretty well, even though their SAT scores may not have indicated that. And think about diversity as a socioeconomic matter, not just as a matter based on other criteria. Think of it socioeconomically as well. And as a faculty member, ask what your own institution is doing about this increasing divide of those who go to college and those who don't, and those who don't being really in the bottom end of the economic ladder more and more. I know this now seems to get to be a very long wish list, but if we don't do something about K through 12 public education, none of this will happen either. That means better, more equitable funding statewide for public education. It also means, I think, more consistency in curricula based not on standardized tests for students in states, but actual course curricula. And one model I'd suggest is the New York State Regents model that was used for a long time, in which they said, you take these courses, here's what the kind of material that should be in the courses, and we'll give you a test at the end of the course. It's a kind of state version of the advanced placement test. Worked very well for New York State for a long time. And finally, and this is a very difficult suggestion for me to make, but I would hope that businesses and corporations would consider again spending the amount of money they once spent on employee training rather than the amount they do now. In the 1950s and 60s, a lot of businesses spent 3 to 4% of their budget on employee training, and they now spend 1 to 2%. That's a very significant drop. Of course, they would love to have people come from college or high school who can hit the ground running and don't need any training. It saves them the trouble, it's more efficient, it's pretty good. But on the other hand, it's creating a situation where if that's the expectation, then increasingly colleges turn into institutions that are expected to produce that kind of job training. And that's demanded of them, which I think can have an effect on colleges that isn't entirely healthy, because they should remain as independent institutions. I know those are all small suggestions, but I think the problems are pretty significant. And if you take all those small suggestions and add them up, maybe something can be done to tackle what I think is both a promise of American higher education, because it's done so well, but one that has now become, in many respects, problematic. Thanks. We have time for questions, and if you have a question, please move to the microphone, which is behind the greenery.
Hi there. In terms of education and income, where do you see the causal thrust? I know they're associated, correlated, but do you see income differentials coming from education or education differentials coming from income? College recruiters would like us to think it's, education to income, but have you teased that out?
Yeah, that's a chicken-egg question that I'm not going to give a very clear answer to because I can't. But I would say that there are a certain number of jobs in this country that pay a certain level, which have been decided are only for college graduates on grounds that I find very hard to understand. So you can't really say there that education actually produces what is needed for a higher income. What you can say is education has produced the credential that is necessary to be hired for that higher income. So we're talking about college now. It's entirely different with the professions. Presumably, in order to be a lawyer or a doctor or a certain kind of engineer, you need very specific training. The old joke is you wouldn't want to get in an airplane that a bunch of surgeons had just gone over. And you wouldn't want an airplane mechanic or engineer to, take your appendix out. That's a different kettle of fish. But for colleges, I think it's very clear that there are certain skills which are prized. Critical thinking is always mentioned, the ability to write well, the ability to communicate, solve problems, work in groups. But a lot of those skills can actually be learned in a good high school by the time one is through with high school education. The actual, say, mathematical skills that a lot of jobs require don't go beyond high school mathematics. That's not true of some jobs, obviously, but it's true of a lot of jobs. A lot of high school students have very good computer skills, for example. Some of them better even than students in college. So I don't really know the answer to that question, except that we have developed a culture in which the assumption is that if you have a college education, you will get paid more, no matter what. And that certain jobs require that, period. There isn't even a justification given for why they require that. It's just a requirement. So no wonder students, when they go to college, not only do they want the degree, they want as many certificates as they can get. A certificate in this language, certificate in that. So the whole proliferation of certificates is part of the credentializing atmosphere that we have entered. And I know, some colleges now have like 40 certificates. And there are some students, not many, but they like to collect them a lot. So they try to figure out their schedule and their curriculum, so they end up with, 6 certificates in a degree. I'm not quite sure that's the best incentive for the educational system, because that's credentializing taken to an extreme. Yes?
So I have a question about how this relates to the way that those 5 reasons for being in college balance out. So if you have more corporate training in college, do you necessarily then create employees who are not going to question, who are going to be good workers, who are not going to question the corporate policy, who are not going to say, do we have this nice new phone because of a war in the Congo, etc. And that actually leads to more global problems that in some ways we might have to pay for if they end up affecting our. So is there an argument therefore that there's a cyclical nature to all of that?
Well, yes, I think so. I mean, I think that's basically what Galbraith is saying. I mean, to put it in crude terms, he's saying you can become a cog in the machine. It's the old notion that if you're just training for something, you become a cog in the machine, a very well-trained cog, a very knowledgeable cog, but you don't question the larger machine. You don't say, well, wait a minute, why is the government doing this, or why is this corporation doing that, or why are we buying that? So to take this to a different level, it isn't just individuals, it's whole institutions. So universities, I think, ought to be the home for individuals who are willing to think independently and critically about any aspect of society. Now, maybe their thought will be proven inaccurate. Maybe it will be proven impractical. But unless we provide that home for people to think that way, the forces of the ambient culture and of ambient institutions are so strong that any such thought will be dismissed or put down or not at all rewarded in any way. You know, the proverb, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. Well, is that what we really want to have happen in our colleges? And I would say no, it's not. We want to provide that space of discourse where you can say something that is critical or outrageous, and at least you can get a hearing of it. And maybe you'll discover that you've got to modify it. I mean, that's a real marketplace of ideas. And that's, I think, ideally what really should occur. Does it always occur? No. It may come in waves given what the ambient culture is doing or the kinds of things that are happening in the country. But I think that institutions need always to be aware that if they do not preserve that space, there are very few other, if any, institutions in the entire country who regard it as their duty to preserve that space for all kinds of intellectual matters. Because churches don't do that for intellectual matters of all kinds. They don't preserve that space. Corporations and businesses generally don't. The government generally doesn't either. It pays you to do a job in the government, understandably. This is a very, very important point. I remember once explaining this, or at least my view of it, to someone, and they said, "Oh, you mean universities should lean against the wind?" And I said, well, not exactly. They just shouldn't be carried away by it. Yes, please.
I want to go back to what seems to be a core contradiction in your talk. On the one hand, you identify an expectation supported by statistics that a college education yields higher incomes or earning potential, but on the other hand, you're also showing statistics also supported by anecdotal evidence. If you think of the recent article about the high cost of law school in the New York Times, that this expectation is increasingly misguided. That college no longer has at the end that higher earning job. Obviously, globalization is a major reason, but I think a lot of blame also has to be given to the universities themselves, who are this kind of industrial college complex, churning out a lot of professional degrees with uncertain futures, and that is true specifically in law schools, medical schools, and these programs that put college students, before they even have their first job, almost into personal bankruptcy. So could you talk a little bit about the role of universities and colleges as being part of the problem, not the solution?
Yes, well, I think to some degree that may be true, although it's in part because of the recession that people who have a college education find it harder to get a job now than they did 3 or 4 years ago. It is still the case that a college education does provide, on average, markedly higher lifetime earnings than someone who has a high school education. There's just no denying that. And the difference is even greater now than it was just 10 years ago, and much greater now than it was 40 years ago. It's also true, as reported in that New York Times article, that college graduates are a little more immune from unemployment than people who are high school graduates. That is, they're more likely to have a job than not have a job. Now, is it true that things are better than they were for college graduates 15 or 20 years ago, or professional school graduates? No, they aren't better in many cases. So, for example, there are a lot more law schools today churning out more law degrees, and it becomes harder when you flood the market with a lot of lawyers for lawyers to walk into very prestigious firms and get wonderful jobs when they're fresh out of law school. I think that's more true of law schools than it is of medical schools, and it's generally more true of law schools at the lower end of reputation than at the higher end of reputation. So there are problems. I wouldn't call them contradictions. I'd call them sort of countercurrents within this. So it is true that students who attend college may get out of college and discover that it is very hard to get a job, and it's actually hard to get a good paying job, particularly now. It doesn't afford the immediate reward that it once did. But if you still look over time, over a period of, say, 10, 15 years out of college after the person has graduated, the advantages are undeniable. They're absolutely undeniable. Of course, people now have more debt than they used to as well. So that's another factor that plays into it, especially people going through public universities. It used to be you thought, well, I can work during the summer and save money, and I can pay my way through the state university. Very hard to do now. Very hard. University of Massachusetts tuition and fees are about $20,000 a year. You know, try making that in a summer job and earning before that in high school. It just doesn't happen. So there's more debt. So there's more financial anxiety surrounding it, but it's still a huge advantage in the end. Still very much an advantage. Bernie and then Dan.
Two interrelated questions. The first one is that your main hypothesis is university as an agent of social change and social transformation. Can you also address the reverse? What is the impact of the social transformation upon the university? That is, to what extent are increasing numbers of students changing the kind of education that we provide in the university and changing our teaching? My experience is that in a way, university is taking over some kind of social basket role or social help role, and that there is an increased burden upon the university and upon faculty to do remedial work that in terms of language, grammar, writing, that is very different than the task of the university a couple of decades ago. So what is the impact then of the increased number of students upon the job of the university, upon the nature of education? The related question then, in terms of your major premise about the university as an agent for social transformation, is there some way of controlling that through comparison with other countries? I'm thinking, for example, of Germany. I know Japan less well, where it seems to me that there is much less of a gap over the past several decades between economic levels that you've been pointing to than we have here, and there is greater opportunity for non-college educated people to have adequate salaries without specializing the task of the social transformation on the university itself?
Well, those are two very big questions, Bernie. I'll try to do them some sort of justice. First of all, I want to be clear that talking about universities as agents of social change, I don't have a specific agenda in mind, other than that there be equal opportunity for students who work hard from different income levels. That, I think, is important. But I also think it's important that universities just not be part of whatever other cultural forces are at work, that they provide this home for independence, for independent thinkers in whatever fields they may be. Indeed, I think that there are pressures from students for different kinds of education. Many students want a degree that they believe prepares them immediately to go to work in a certain field. So the fastest growing major in the United States in the last 3.5 decades is business administration, which means different kinds of things at different institutions. But a BA in business administration. So that's just a phenomenon which has occurred. There's a great demand for it. There's also increased remedial work. There's no doubt about that. I have seen that. You can say, well, how do you see that at Harvard? Well, it's happened. Harvard has changed its admission criteria. It's trying to be even more socioeconomically diverse than it once was, and it already 10, 15 years ago was quite socioeconomically diverse insofar as they felt they could get students who were capable of doing the work there. But yes, it's true at many places. This is one of the reasons why community colleges at their best really play a terribly important role in our whole system. But community colleges are run in different ways in different states with varying degrees of success. They're often underfunded. The pay to teach in them is often very low. The graduation rates are often low. They're very problematic. But undoubtedly the way we teach has changed because lots of schools that could take only the rich and the bright and teach them are trying to take the bright and not always the rich. And that works pretty well, but at a certain point, you can't take only the bright because you've got a very limited number if you want to have any kind of any socioeconomic diversity. And so you have a situation in which you have students who don't write very well, or they go to a high school that doesn't offer calculus at all, just doesn't give it as a course, or they go to a high school where there are no AP courses. So that's hard. Are you going to deny a person a good college education because they went to a high school that had no AP courses and it's the only one that they could afford or their parents could afford? It creates some real challenges for higher education. There are summer programs at some places that try to work around this. There are programs that are not during regular term time. There are programs that try to boost students up in the summer before they come to college, all kinds of things, but it needs to be addressed. Other countries, comparative international higher education is not my strength, but I would just say one or two quick things. Yes, in many other countries, in Europe for example, this kind of gap between the college educated and the non-college educated does not exist to the extent it does in this country. There are all kinds of apprentice programs, true, based on earlier tracking. So you're, at age 14 or something, it may be pretty clear what's going to happen, or age 16. But it ends up that the actual income disparity in those countries, for various reasons, including tax reasons, is less. But it's interesting, for example, that the country in Europe that has the lowest rate of students getting a college degree is Switzerland. Now, Switzerland's a pretty prosperous country. So the correlation between college education and national prosperity is a pretty dicey one. And the Financial Times some years ago ran a very interesting article to show that the more people you have going to what you in your country call college doesn't necessarily mean the stronger your economy or the better paid your workers. There's no absolute correlation there. It's a very interesting and much contested area of the economics of comparative higher education internationally, because there are arguments on both sides. But of course, it's because many of the countries' systems differ so much.
My question was about the striking graph on the front page of your handout and where it fits into your argument. As I say, it's extremely striking that it shows that people are deluding themselves, or possibly it shows that people didn't understand that the question was about wealth rather than income, though even then they would be deluding themselves. And I suppose my question was, to what extent is wealth really the factor that you need to take into account for your argument? Would income work better, or would income over a large number of years? Now, the reason for this is the first thing I thought was, well, gosh, I expected a lot of students who are going to be in the top bracket are present in the very bottom bracket.
Right. Well, those are very good questions. Let's talk about income and wealth just for a second. And recall that I'm a professor of English, not of economics, but I'll try my best here on income and wealth. I showed one chart which was just income and not wealth, and this chart is wealth. This is net worth. So one of the ways to look at it is that if at a certain point, for each additional dollar you make, you actually can do a lot more different things with that than you could with an earlier dollar you earned. Because you've paid for food, or you've paid for housing, you've paid for basic necessities. That's why, sometimes when you go to these federal drug sales of drug lords, you see a whole bunch of diamond pave Rolex watches, and Rolls Royces, and things like that. It's because the extra wealth permits you to just consume conspicuously, or sock it away and try to pass it on. And that's a little different. It means that you've utterly taken care of basic needs, including education, if that's what you want to do. So there's a certain threshold at which it becomes easier to afford additional things. And my point is simply that based on both income and particularly on wealth, it's very hard for certain families to have that extra little bit. It's got to be borrowed, or it's just not going to happen.
But how many?
How many?
How many families? What would the percentage look like?
Well, we have a situation now in which the bottom 2 quintiles are really in tough shape in this country. That's 40% of the population, which is roughly the same percentage of those that don't have health insurance, or used to not have health insurance, which was, well, approximately that in terms of those people compared with working. You had, 40 million people who didn't have health insurance. So it's not that percentage, but if you view that as, a kind of indication of if they could afford it, would they get it? Well, some of them would, not all of them, perhaps some of them would. But I guess what I'm saying is that if you keep that income level at a certain place for people in the bottom 2 quintiles, whereas the people in the top 2 quintiles are moving up. I mean, it's the proverb of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. That's what's happening vis-a-vis higher education, to put it simply. That's why I think this makes a difference. And you say deluded. Well, I'm not sure that they just don't, people apparently just don't understand that that's the situation in the United States. They simply don't understand that wealth is distributed in the way that it actually is. Now, if people generally did understand that, would they ask for different policies? Would they ask for different tuition rates? Would they ask for different financial aid policies in higher education? I don't know. But I would say a first step is for people to understand what the actual distribution of wealth is. Now, why use wealth rather than income there? Because you can use wealth to pay for higher education. You don't use just your annual income in most cases. You use the assets that you have. That's why every college that asks you to fill out a form, or the FAFSA form in this country, says, what are your assets? Not just what is your annual income, but what are your assets, meaning what is your wealth? And so that you are expected actually to eat into in order to help pay for college. So it's the actual wealth you have that matters, not just your income. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Jim Engell. I'm told that the reception, Jim's comments notwithstanding, is justified and it awaits your attention over here.